The year is 1305, and the streets of London hum with a suffocating sense of dark anticipation. A vast and relentless crowd gathers not to celebrate, but to witness something far more macabre. A procession moves through the narrow streets, dragging with it the broken form of a man whose name would forever be etched in the blood-stained annals of history. The sound of hooves pounding the cobblestones echoes, followed by the sickening scrape of raw flesh against stone. The air is thick with the stench of fear, sweat, and the unmistakable scent of death. The man at the center of this grim parade is not some nameless thief or petty criminal. It is Adrian Thorne, a man who had the audacity to stand against the relentless power of the kingdom. His body, barely recognizable, is torn and battered, his skin hanging in tatters, a testament to the cruelty of those who had captured him. He is naked, stripped of everything: his dignity, his strength, his identity, save for his defiance, which still burns in his eyes, smoldering with a fire that refuses to be extinguished, even as the crowd hurls insults and spits upon his broken form. This is no ordinary story. It is not a tale of glory or heroism. It is one of brutal betrayal, relentless sacrifice, and a desperate struggle for freedom that transcended mere survival. This is not the story of a lone individual, but of a people, an entire nation crushed beneath the oppressive boot of a tyrant. This is a story of an empire that would stop at nothing, absolutely nothing, to bend the will of its subjects. But here's the thing. What if everything you've been taught about history is a lie? What if the heroes of the past were not saints, but victims of an unspeakable systema system designed to subjugate, exploit, and erase the very spirit of those who dared to resist? Before we delve deeper into this dark and forgotten chapter of the past, I invite you to pause and reflect. Consider subscribing to Untold Legacy, where we seek out the uncomfortable truths that history has buried beneath layers of myth and propaganda. And as always, let me know where you're tuning in from. Your thoughts and questions shape these stories, and together, we can unravel the forgotten legacies that still echo through our world today. The world Adrian was born into was not always so cruel. It was the year 1265, and in the serene countryside of Eldonridge, where rolling hills and vibrant forests seemed untouched by the weight of human conflict, a child was born to humble beginnings. Adrian Thorne entered the world in a modest stone cottage, nestled on the edge of a thriving village, the son of a blacksmith. His father, a man of quiet strength, had inherited the craft from his own father and had envisioned a future where Adrian would one day take over the forge. It was a simple, predictable life, one rooted in the rhythms of labor and tradition. Yet from the moment Adrian could walk, it was clear that the path his father had envisioned was not the one he would follow. Adrian's size was the first thing that set him apart. By his early teens, he towered over most boys his age, and by his 20s, he had become a physical force to be reckoned with. His broad shoulders and calloused hands, the product of years of toil in the forge, made him an imposing figure. Yet it wasn't just his body that caught the attention of those around him. Adrian was sharp not just in body, but in mind. He could read the land as he read a map, calculating terrain, timing, and strategy. He devoured books when others did not, immersing himself in philosophy and the languages of ancient texts, and he quickly became a figure of both physical and intellectual prowess in Eldonridge. But more than anything, it was Adrian's spirit that set him apart. From a young age, he began to question the world around him, the inequalities, the hypocrisies, the systems of control that shaped his life. Eldonridge, once a peaceful land where the people lived harmoniously with the earth, had slowly begun to change under the rule of King Richard IV, a monarch more feared than loved, who had ascended the throne with an iron fist. The kingdom, which had once flourished with wealth from fertile lands and strong commerce, had begun to crack at the seams. The king, in his relentless thirst for power, saw nothing but opportunity in these cracks, an opportunity to tighten his grip on the common folk and expand his empire. King Richard's reign was marked by cruelty laws that crushed the poor and emboldened the wealthy. Loyalty was demanded at the point of a sword, and any resistance was met with swift and brutal retribution. Adrian, as he grew older, began to see the growing signs of corruption. What was once a prosperous and peaceful kingdom had become a hollow shell, ruled by men who cared little for the lives they destroyed, so long as their own positions remained secure. The people were nothing but pawns in a game where the stakes were nothing less than survival. The kingdom's unrest was mirrored in the royal court. The death of King Edward III had left a power vacuum, and noble houses, once content to bicker among themselves, now saw an opportunity to vie for control of the crown. The resulting instability left the land ripe for conquest, and King Richard, ever the opportunist, capitalized on the chaos. He declared that tribute would be raised, squeezing his people's wealth to fund further wars of expansion. His demands were unreasonable, his expectations unbearable. It wasn't long before whispers of rebellion began to circulate in the darkest corners of Eldenridge. The kingdom was broken, and Adrian Thorne, with his strength, intellect, and burning dissatisfaction, began to feel the stirrings of a fire that would soon engulf the entire nation. Yet for many years, Adrian kept his peace. He was no fool. He understood the dangers of speaking out against the king. He watched, he waited, and in the quiet, he planned. But it wasn't until tragedy struck that the fire inside him would be ignited. In 1294, Adrian's life took a tragic turn. Isabella Fairford, a woman of grace, intelligence, and beauty, one whom Adrian had loved for as long as he could remember, was killed. Isabella was the daughter of a respected family in Eldenridge, known for their lineage and deep ties to the land. The murder was brutal and senseless. A band of King Richard's soldiers, sent on orders to terrorize the local populace and force compliance with the king's demands, had caught wind of Isabella's family's resistance to the crown's tribute increases. They raided her family's estate, dragging her from her home, and in a cruel act of violence, murdered her in the street. It was an act so senseless and so cruel that even the most hardened men of Eldenridge were shaken to their core. What happened next was just as damning. The men who killed Isabella were not brought to justice. They were protected by the corrupt hands of the crown, shielded by a system that cared little for the lives of common people. No trial, no justice, no consequences. Isabella's family was left broken, and Adrian's heart was shattered. The grief he felt was like a weight that crushed him from the inside. But it was the injustice, the complete, unrelenting sense of betrayal that awakened something within him. His rage was no longer just a personal loss. It was the culmination of all the years of watching the kingdom tear itself apart, of seeing the suffering of those who had nothing, while the ruling class continued to grow fat and entitled. Adrian's mind, sharp as ever, began to turn with new purpose. The man who had once pondered the theoretical faults of a system now saw with absolute clarity that his country was in chains. The blood of his beloved Isabella had been spilled for nothing, for a kingdom that had forsaken the very people it was meant to serve. And in the silence of that moment, Adrian made a vow not for vengeance, but for something far greater, a cause that transcended personal loss. He would not let Isabella's death be in vain. His sword would not merely avenge Harit, would carve a path for all the oppressed to follow, a path toward freedom, justice, and a world where the people's voices could rise above the corruption of the crown. From that day forward, Adrian Thorne was no longer just a blacksmith's son. He was a symbol, a leader, a force that would ignite a rebellion across the land. His time had come, and the kingdom's day of reckoning was fast approaching. The rebellion that Adrian Thorne sparked in 1297 was not the slow, steady build of a conventional uprising. It was an explosion, a rapid surge of rage and grief that transformed a single man's personal vendetta into the rallying cry for a nation's freedom. What began with small, isolated raid-shit-and-run strikes against the royal patrols quickly grew into something far more powerful. News of Adrian's defiance spread like wildfire through the villages, farms, and outposts of Eldenridge. The common folk, long subjugated to the cruelty of King Richard IV's empire, began to whisper his name with reverence. Adrian wasn't just a criminal. He was a symbol of hope, of justice, a beacon in a land darkened by tyranny. The fires of resistance were stoked by Adrian's charisma, by his unwavering commitment to his cause, and by the burning desire for revenge that he carried deep within him. As more men and women from all walks of life, peasants, blacksmiths, soldiers, even former criminals joined his ranks, the rebellion grew in both numbers and strength. Yet Adrian never let the swelling ranks of his forces cloud his vision. He wasn't just a leader of a band of rebels. He was a strategist, a thinker who saw the kingdom's battle as more than a war of survival. This was about shaking the very foundations of the empire, breaking its grip on the people. By 1298, the time for subtlety and ambushes was over. The moment for a decisive confrontation had arrived. Adrian knew that the heart of King Richard's power lay in his capital, and the key to cutting off the head of the snake was Eldenford Bridge, the gateway to the city. The bridge, a narrow, fortified choke point, was one of the crown's most heavily guarded positions. It was here, in this critical juncture, that Adrian would make his stand. His army, though only 5,000 strong, was not a ragtag collection of misfits. It was a finely tuned machine, forged in the fires of resistance. The rebels held the high ground, a tactical advantage the English forces would never expect to exploit. The king's army, a formidable force of 15,000 men, including the famed English heavy cavalry, was positioned on the far side of the bridge, poised to crush Adrian's rebellion once and for all. Adrian's plan was simple but devastating. He understood the limitations of his forces. Though they were brave, they were outnumbered, and the English army would overwhelm them in a direct confrontation. But the terrain, the narrow bridge that spanned the deep river gorge, was where Adrian saw his opportunity. The bridge, barely wide enough to allow for two men to fight side by side, would become a death trap for any army foolish enough to cross it in full force. For hours, Adrian's forces lay in wait, hidden on the high ground overlooking the bridge, watching as the English troops slowly began to cross, their numbers swelling with each passing hour. Adrian knew the time would come when they would have to move. When half of the enemy's army was committed to the bridge, they would be trapped. He waited, his heart beating in time with the rhythm of the advancing enemy. At last, the moment arrived. With a signal from Adrian, the rebels launched their assault. They poured down the hillside like a wave crashing upon a cliff, their battle cries filling the air, their spears and arrows cutting through the first wave of English soldiers. The English army, caught in the narrow confines of the bridge, was powerless to maneuver. Their cavalry, heavy with armor, was trapped at the rear, unable to charge or form a line of defense. The infantry, too, were caught in the bottleneck, unable to bring their full force to bear. The bridge became a slaughterhouse. Adrian's forces, though outnumbered, fought with the fury of those who had nothing left to lose. The rebels struck with precision, forcing their way through the mass of soldiers like a blade through soft flesh. The screams of the dying filled the air as the English forces were crushed under the weight of their own numbers, trampled in the narrow confines of the bridge. The chaos was absolute. Men were crushed beneath the stampede, bodies piled upon bodies, and the sound of steel against steel echoed through the valley. Adrian, from his vantage point, watched the scene unfold with cold, calculating precision. Every move, every decision he made was designed to maximize the destruction of the English army. His forces, though outnumbered, were quick, agile, and coordinated. The English cavalry, unable to break through the crush of bodies, was rendered useless. The battle shifted in an instant from a certain English victory to a chaotic rout. The king's forces, disoriented and overwhelmed, attempted to retreat, but the bridge had become a death trap. The narrow span allowed no room for retreat, and the remaining English soldiers were forced to fight to the bitter end. Adrian's men, fueled by the promise of freedom and justice, cut down every soldier that stood in their way. The English army, once so sure of their victory, was decimated. The losses were catastrophic. In just a few hours, the tide of the battle turned irreversibly, and Adrian Thorne had delivered a crushing blow to the Crown's power. The victory at Eldonford Bridge would go down in history as one of the greatest military victories ever achieved by an underdog force. Adrian's tactics, his brilliance as a strategist, had turned the tide of the war in a single, decisive moment. For the first time in years, the people of Eldonridge, oppressed and silenced by the king's tyranny, dared to hope. For the first time, they believed that the rule of King Richard IV could be overthrown, that freedom was within their grasp. But King Richard, enraged by the humiliating defeat, would not allow such an affront to stand. The defeat at Eldonford Bridge was more than a mere loss in battle. It was an existential threat to his reign. No monarch, especially one as ruthless as Richard, would tolerate such an act of rebellion without retribution. Adrian Thorne, now a hero to the oppressed and a symbol of defiance, had become the king's greatest threat. Soon, the full wrath of the crown would be unleashed upon Adrian and his rebellion. The battle that had started as a spark of hope would soon ignite into a firestorm of vengeance, one that would burn through the kingdom and test Adrian's resolve like never before. The stakes had never been higher. The question now was not if Adrian would face retribution, but how much he was willing to sacrifice to keep the flame of resistance alive. The final days of Adrian Thorne unfolded not on the battlefield, but in the shadow of betrayal. Barrett Kane, a man once loyal to Adrian's cause, had succumbed to the king's promises of wealth and power. Lured by the allure of security, Barrett betrayed the very soul of the rebellion he had sworn to support. In a secluded forest, he captured Adrian stripped of his weapons and his will to fight, and delivered him into the hands of King Richard's executioners. Adrian was dragged through the streets of London, bound and humiliated before a crowd eager for his suffering. The king's intent was clear: to destroy not just the man, but the spirit of rebellion itself. Adrian's execution was brutal, his body torn apart in a grotesque display meant to send a stark message to anyone who dared defy the throne. The blood spilled that day stained more than the cobblestones. It marked the end of an era of defiance in the eyes of the crown. Yet, in the aftermath of Adrian's agonizing death, something unexpected took root. Despite the king's efforts to erase Adrian from history, his name became a symbol of resistance, not just for Eldonridge, but for all those oppressed beneath the weight of the monarchy. His death had not extinguished the fire he had sparked, it had only fueled it. Adrian Thorne's martyrdom immortalized his cause, and his legacy lived on, carried in the hearts of those who had once dared to follow him. The rebellion may have been crushed, but the spirit of resistance Adrian ignited would burn for generations to come. Adrian, the blacksmith's son, had become a beacon of defiance, a testament to the unbreakable will of those who dare to challenge tyranny. In reflecting on Adrian's sacrifice, ask yourself, if you had lived in his time, would you have fought for freedom, knowing the cost? Or would you have kept silent, allowing the suffering to continue? The truth is this: freedom is not born from the crowned, is forged in the hearts of those who rise against it. And so, as we've seen, the story of William Wallace is far more than just a tale of battles and bloodshed. It's a testament to the indomitable spirit of a man who dared to dream of freedom, who stood defiant against overwhelming odds, and who, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, refused to surrender his principles. His sacrifice, though brutal, ignited a flame that ultimately led to Scotland's independence and cemented his place as a true national hero. It's a stark reminder that the fight for liberty often comes at a terrible cost, but the ideals are always worth fighting for. What did you think of Wallace's journey? What resonated with you most? We'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, or reflections in the comments below. Where are you watching from? Let us know. It's amazing to connect with fellow history buffs from across the globe. If you enjoyed diving into this pivotal moment in history, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on our upcoming explorations of other fascinating stories. We have so much more to uncover together. And speaking of more, the story doesn't end here. We're just scratching the surface. Be sure to check out part 2 for a deeper dive into the aftermath of Wallace's execution, the rise of Robert the Bruce, and the ultimate triumph of Scottish independence. You won't want to miss it.